So the drivers that are affecting the market are fairly obvious, with significant decarbonization and renewable targets. We have a 34% greenhouse gas emission by 2020 target, and we also have the European Renewable Energy Directive targets. And this is going to, this implies a significant shift in terms of our energy mix or electricity mix. It will mean up to a third of our electricity will come from renewable energy. Now, the policy response has been, I think as David very much highlighted, DEC's EMR, which is a flagship policy package to address some of these issues, the renewable issues, but also the security of supply issues and some of the affordability aspects. In addition to that, there are other ongoing elements of reform that Ofgem has been doing and that are also taking place within the wider European context. So to name a few, Ofgem is at the moment, we are reviewing plans for investment in transmission network over the next decade, where we'll be spending billions of money under the RIO program. In addition to that, the ongoing work looking at how transmission charging arrangements should work and whether we should make any significant changes to ensure that the market can, the GB system in the market can cope over the long term. Other changes that we're doing is we're looking at how, for instance, cash-out arrangements work, and in fairly very simple terms, effectively how we incentivize generators and suppliers to ensure that by the time we get to the period when National Grid as a system operator has to balance the system, that everyone's position is relatively balanced, which in turn will reduce the costs of managing and operating the system as a whole, and therefore feed on to potentially lower costs for consumers. In general, all of this is intended to ensure that the system is decarbonized. We increasingly move to a more sustainable and renewable generation mix, but at the same time ensuring that security of supply aspects are retained, and also at the same time that cost, affordability and cost to consumers remain as low as we possibly can. Now, underlying this, obviously, it's not quite clear whether existing trading arrangements, how we trade wholesale market in the GB, is actually will actually cope with all that's changing. And we're beginning to see a little bit of evidence of, I suppose, some of the creaks within the arrangements. So, for instance, the slide you're seeing is constraint costs, which in very simple terms is effectively the amount of money that National Grid spends in managing the system where there's not sufficient transmission capacity. So if you think about it, we've been there's a lot of wind farms, for instance, being developed in Scotland, but at the moment we don't have sufficient transmission capacity. But over the next decade, the goal is to ensure that under RIO that we build enough transmission capacity to be able to get much of that to where the demand is, so primarily London and the south. But in the meantime, National Grid has to spend money to effectively manage the system, and that's sort of an illustration of the changes we're already seeing and potentially will be increasing over time. The second change that we're increasingly seeing is that when the current market arrangements were designed and launched in 2005, we were not only effectively the electricity system was very much based on flexible plants which could provide electricity. As mentioned, that's changing with a lot of wind, which means potentially more cost in managing the system. But the other aspect of that is that we're increasingly also less isolated from Europe. So we can't avoid looking at the larger picture in terms of the European context. And this just shows you, in 2010, we had about 2.5 gigawatt in interconnection capacity. By the end of this year, we'll probably have 4 gigawatts, and that's effectively by 2020 potentially up to 10 to 12% of 10% of the electricity during peak demand could be supplied via interconnection, via links that we have with neighboring markets. So that has significant implications in terms of how we use those links. It could effectively provide opportunities for managing and operating the system a lot more efficiently. But if we're unable to use the available interconnection capacity well, then actually it could exacerbate the challenges that the national grid has in terms of managing the system. And I'll probably, as we talk about some of the European regulatory developments, I think we'll probably unpick some of the potential benefits of how this new world is going to look like. So you've probably all heard about EMR. The other aspect, which I'd like to think of effectively as almost an EMR equivalent from Europe, is what we call the target model, which is perhaps less clear to most, just because it's currently under development. By way of context, member states committed themselves sometime last year to developing a single or an integrated energy market in Europe by 2014. In addition to that, we've had successive packages of legislation which effectively try to, the aim or the goal of which is to ensure that European markets are increasingly integrated and harmonized. So the goal is effectively an integrated electricity market in Europe. The benefits of that is potentially we have significant benefits for consumers, but also that we have significant benefits for consumers. The way the target model works is in effect mirrors how electricity is currently traded within most markets. So if you think about the way electricity is traded, there are several different time frames. You could, in effect, buy electricity from, say, a generator, you're a supplier, a few months or a year or two in advance and lock in effectively a price. Or alternatively, you could wait until and buy the electricity within the day-ahead market, effectively within the spot market, in effect. And then beyond that, there's an opportunity to effectively refine your position as a supplier or as a generator. And that's effectively, which allows for continuous trading up until that point when we have to close effectively all accounts, as it were, to allow National Grid to balance the system. What European legislation is doing is, in effect, is to try and harmonize the different arrangements in each of these time frames across Europe, and to make it in such a way that allows ease of cross-border trading that will benefit member states. So, for instance, the benefits, so within the day ahead, the rules call for how we use interconnection. So in future, transmission capacity, say, for instance, between the GB market and Britain and France will be allocated solely based on price. So if prices are higher in, say, in our market because we have a significant shortage, then because of the pricing mechanism, power should flow from France to our market to help us effectively balance the system, or effectively to provide cheaper sources of energy to manage the GB system. Within the day ahead, just before we get to the stage where National Grid has to balance the system, the new rules also allow for continuous trading. And the implication of this is that as we connect more and more wind, and as it becomes clear how much wind is going to be generating before we get to the point where we have to balance the system, then we'll be able, for instance, at the moment, to under these new arrangements, to export much of that to a market that has less wind and probably needs it. So at the moment, the way the system works is that National Grid has to figure out how to balance the system, but that may mean that actually it curtails wind because there's too much of it in the system. And that's a problem that's going to become worse in the next couple of years when we have almost a third of our electricity coming from wind. So those are some of the potential benefits in terms of ensuring that we have access to cheaper generation in other markets and therefore lower prices for us. It allows national grid access to generation in other markets, which could help us balance our system. And the overall impact of that potentially is a lower cost to consumers. In terms of timeline, Ofgem, working with other regulators and with market participants across Europe, are developing rules for how we will implement the target model and harmonize markets across Europe. These rules will become binding by 2014, so effectively will be go to comitology, and once they're approved, become binding legislation. I think the one last thing to comment is that the impact of these arrangements will have significant interactions with DEX EMR reforms. So potentially it may mean we may need, as we design feed-in tariffs, for instance, to consider how they might work with cross-border trading and other aspects. Thank you.